you or your supervisor or your co-authors have decided that you've got something, that you've got the ideas worked out, you've gone through the mathematics or the statistics, you've done the coding, you've essentially got something that's out there ready to go. And what happens from then on? So I'm taking it as that we're at a situation where we've done the research. And so what we need to do is we need to prepare our paper, think about who might be authors. We've got to decide a journal to submit it to. We've got to submit it. We've got to deal with what happens at that stage. At some stage, we're going to get referees' reports back. And if our paper gets accepted, we might have to deal with a few other things. And I'll just say something at the end about page charges. Okay, so preparing the paper. So I want to say this, and most of this talk will be from the point of view of an editor. So I've been an editor, it said in the notification for this talk, I've been an editor-in-chief for 16 years of an applied probability journal. I still am the editor-in-chief of a couple of different applied probability journals. I've been on an editorial board for more than 20 years. So I have seen, I don't know how many papers I've seen cross my desk, but it's probably in 4 figures. And so when I'm talking about the point of view of an editor. And what I'm trying to get over, because that's experience that some of you will have had, but most of you won't, right? And when you're an editor, you get to see things from a different perspective. So that's really where I'm coming from. And I hope people will challenge some of the things I say. So this is a quote that my PhD supervisor, Charles Pearce, and I'll be giving a couple of quotes from Charles today. He had some very pithy ways of saying things. And one thing he told me when I was just about to graduate is that the most important part of any paper is the introduction. And that's a bit weird because most of us would disagree with that. That's not what we think about. The most important part of any paper is the research, isn't it? It's theorem 1, or it's the main result, or whatever. We don't even write the introduction until we've done everything else. So we just try and wrap it off really quickly so that the paper looks like it's got an introduction. We don't usually think about the introduction being the most important part of a paper. But Charles said it was. And as with all that editorial experience I was telling you about, I agree with him. I think it is. And the point about that is that the introduction is the first thing everyone reads. They read the abstract and they read the introduction. The introduction's where you get the chance to set the agenda for the paper. You get the chance to talk about the background and then say what you're doing. And the reason that I think it's important is if you do that well, a few other things later on get forgiven. You might have a little flaw in your argument in the proof of your main result. But if you've actually got the referee interested and you sort of got them on your side and they notice a little thing, they'll write a referee's report that says, yeah, there's a little flaw in the main result. You need to fix it up. Or, you need to do some more numerical things, or you need to do something, If you've got the referee on your side, little things later on do get forgiven. If you piss the referee off by making it hard, they don't give you any slack. So that's the point about the most important part of any paper being the introduction, is that it's the bit where you actually get the chance to set the agenda. And you shouldn't rush it. So I'd encourage you, yeah, sure, I get the point that you've done everything, you've got the hard bits done, and you really want to get the paper out. Well, I just suggest take a little bit of time with that. Try and, you're in it, it's your research, you're passionate about it, you've been thinking about it for months, maybe years. You get it. But no one else is in that space, right? Everyone else looks at it and thinks, oh God, another paper's turned up, I've got to deal with it. And you read the introduction and you're starting from the point where the person is probably not excited like you are about what you've just done. And you have to get them excited. And that's what the introduction's all about. So you need to think about it from that way.
So it's also the part of the paper most people will read.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, abstracts even a shorter bit. And abstracts, I mean, quite often introductions almost repeat what's in an abstract. An abstract, you've got to think it goes out once the paper has been accepted and it's out there, and it's what maybe people might point your way to the paper. But a referee and an editor are always going to look at the introduction. They may only look at the introduction. That's why you need to get it right. So Nathan's given a little comment. Does anyone else want to make any comments on that point?
Yeah, Peter?
Yeah?
Yeah, look, I always think of the introduction as basically the blueprint for the rest of the paper as well. It's essentially telling you the rest of the things you're going to write and the rest of the things you're going to have to explain.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It's really important to make sure that's as tight and solid as you can get it, just so the paper as a whole is the same way. So, yes, I agree with your advisor. It is the most important part.
Great, yeah. Okay, so we haven't yet managed to say anything too controversial. All right, so that's one thing. This is the sort of stuff that I talk to my students about. We should all be trying to develop our own style of structuring a paper. We don't have to be completely original. So we've got an introduction, then we've got an explanation, an introduction. Maybe we need to provide some background. So maybe section 2 gives some background, sets up a model. Section 3 is usually, for me, where I actually prove the main results. And maybe section 4 might be some numerical things. It can move in different directions. But think about your own way. And it evolves over time, and it depends on you, and it has to be personal. But think about the way of doing that. Develop your own style of writing. So here's an example. When you refer to the literature, you must use consistent tense. That's just a thing in English, and everyone's smiling at you because my students have heard me say that many times. Now, you can refer to papers in the present. You can say, Barbara does this, or Ross did this, if you want to refer in the past. But you can't say Ross did this and Barbara does this in two adjacent sentences. That's not acceptable academic writing. Now, I always write in the past tense, and I tell you why I always write in the past tense. It's because it's easy to tell a story in the past tense. So Ross wrote the seminal paper in this area, and then Barbara built on it. I can use that. But it's not so natural to say Ross writes the seminal paper in this area and Barbara builds on it. I mean, you can say that, it's not wrong, it's just not quite as natural, or at least it isn't for me. So I know that if I'm going to talk about literature, I'm going to write in the past tense, and I'm going to write it as if I'm telling a story. Now that works for me. It might not work for you. Doesn't matter, but you've got to adopt your own style to do that. Another thing that works for me is to put conditions at the front of a sentence. So if I want to say for all A, such and such is true, I'll put the for all A at the stop, at the front. Whereas a lot of people say such and such is true for all A. And that's perfectly fine too, except if the for all A gets really complicated, and sometimes it does. And it's generally easier to put conditions up the front than the end. Now, again, it's not wrong to do it differently, but I do what works for me. So I'd encourage you all to just think about how you write and just get yourself a routine. It makes it easier to write papers if you do that. Any comments or questions? English exposition. It's one of these things like introduction. You can possibly be forgiven for having poor exposition, but it's certainly a negative that chips away at something. And I'll talk a little bit about what happens when you submit a paper. One of the things that can happen is an editor-in-chief just rejects it. And the editor-in-chief is going to be more likely to reject it straight away if the exposition isn't good. So, and again, there's a little bit of give and take there. If I get a paper submitted by 3 people in the middle of China, where they're unlikely to have access to a native English speaker, then I'm going to forgive some errors about the exposition. If I get a paper submitted by a Mandarin speaker at the University of Melbourne, well, I would say that would be a conflict of interest. Say a Mandarin speaker at some other Australian university, I wouldn't be too happy about it if it had errors of exposition, because that person does have access to native English speakers, and that person should ask native English speakers to help. Right? And, you know, it's a fact that at the moment, the international literature is in English. Maybe in 20 years' time, it will be in Mandarin. And those of us who don't speak Mandarin will have to learn. But therefore, it means that even if you're not a native speaker, you need to learn to write properly in English. And I'm not saying that something can happen overnight, but it is the way it's done. And there are people around the world, in particular, non-native speakers from different languages can be very critical of each other. So it's in your own interest to make your English exposition as good as it possibly can be. So don't have spelling mistakes. And I know it's really difficult because English has definite and indefinite articles. We have A and D, and a lot of other languages don't have that. And it's really hard for people whose native language doesn't have A and D to write in English and get it right. So that's fine. We understand that it's not easy. Therefore, get someone to help. It's still not good having papers where these errors are sitting there when they get submitted. Same with plurals, and same with tense. And just a couple, I just thought I'd put a couple of my pet hates. There is no time the word notation should have an S on the end. You see it all the time. Notations are collective now. Doesn't matter how many of them there are, it's notation, it doesn't have an S. And there are certain verbs in English, and allows one of these verbs, that must have an object. You can't allow to do something. You can allow someone to do something. So they happen a lot in maths papers. So just a couple of things to avoid. Anyone want to make any comments or feedback about the general area of exposition? Has anyone got any little tricks that they use that help?
Yeah, Peter, I rely quite heavily on Grammarly.
Yeah.
And there's also a very good book called Style Towards Clarity and Grace, which has actually a big section on how to avoid academic writing.
Yeah.
That is, you know, becoming bogged down in overly Baroque language, blah, blah, blah. So both those are quite good resources. Grammarly, even if you pay for the premium version, is not that expensive. So yeah.
I will comment that mathematical writing is often a little bit different to writing in the other sciences. And one of the things that I don't like about writing in the other sciences, it's often written in the passive voice. Like 36 subjects were selected and 23 of them were put into the control group, and 13 of them were put in the treatment group or whatever. They write everything in the passive voice. The style in the mathematical science is actually quite weird. We write in the first person and generally use the word we. And I believe grammatically that actually is a royal plural. It's like when the Queen says we are not amused. That's actually grammatically what we're doing. But one of my mentors, Ernie Tutt, used to say the right way to think about it is that when you write we integrate this equation to produce or whatever. It's like the writer and the reader working together. And the writer is leading the reader through it. And so we do this and we produce this is a way of thinking that. And I find that if I think that way, I write well. So the we is something. I personally don't like the passive voice in the mathematical science writing. Some of these grammatical things do tell you to do that, but it all depends. I'm not aware of the ones that you quoted though. Any other comments?
Yes, having lived in a foreign language environment for a long time, I would say when you get someone to help, just give them the introduction.
Yeah.
The rest is fine. Make it clear that it's the introduction.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, Andrew. I mean, it goes back to the first point, introductions. A lot of things are forgiven if you've actually got the reader on side with your introduction. So.
Yeah, Peter?
Yeah?
Yeah, listen, I'm going to disagree with the use of the royal we. I don't like writing in the first person. It's annoying to me because I really don't want to hear about how great you are. I want to read about your work. And I think it's quite possible to write not in the first person and not fall into the trap of speaking in passive voice. You can do that, and I think it's quite effective. It makes the story not about the writer, which again, I'm not the subject of the paper, my work is. So I like to put that first rather than me doing stuff.
That's okay, and look, we all, as I said, we all have our own style. So one thing I would say, and this in particular, not so much for papers, but PhD student theses, is it's got to be clear who's made what contribution. And in particular, when people write in a passive voice, it's not clear whether you're talking about what happened in a paper that you're referring to or what you've done. Was it these other guys who selected 36 subjects and put 13 of them in the control group and 23 of them in the treatment group, or is it you? If you're writing the passive voice, often that's not clear. I mean, if you write in the first person, it is. But I agree, that does put you into the story. Sometimes, as with a PhD thesis, I think you have to be in the story. Okay, but as it's about us thinking and developing our own styles. Any other comments?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's important though, because I think the distinction between a PhD dissertation and an article for publication, the purposes are two different things.
Yeah, sure. I accept that.
And so definitely, I think for the PhD, yes, writing in that first person voice to make it clear that I am the one doing this work, it is good in that instance.
Mehdi, you had a comment.
I'm not a native speaker. Just what I do is that if I have 40 pages paper, I send it to maybe 5 pages to each one native person, and then collect them and, understand what I should do. About the structure, I feel that native speaker, they prefer different structures, something like this. So sometimes if you send a paper that even a native speaker checked it to somebody, maybe he or she don't like it, something like this.
That's sure. I mean, and there's no rules. I mean, one of the things about English is rules are difficult. I've tried to explain rules to people and there aren't any people. Maybe Andrew's advice is the thing. Introduction is the thing you need to get right, and the rest of it is probably less critical. It's also, I find most English mistakes get made in introductions. They don't get made so much once we get into the mathematics, because mathematics is much more structured anyway. And you can learn how to speak the mathematical English relatively, I think it's a simpler structure than it is for, trying to be free form in an introduction. So I agree that introduction is probably the most important part to get someone to help you with. All right. So, authorship. Now, these are different, again, we have I think a different culture in mathematical sciences than a lot of other sciences and even other disciplines do. This is a quote of 3 quotes from a paper that I wrote back in 2007 with Alan Carey and Mike Cowling. Alan was head of maths at ANU and Mike was head of maths at the University of New South Wales. I was head of maths here in Melbourne. And we tried to write a thing which was published in the Australian Maths Society Gazette that somehow tried to capture the research culture of the mathematical sciences. And we did this because we thought that various quantitative metrics would start getting applied, and I think we were right in that. And that we needed to have this. And in fact, I know a lot of people have used this in their grant applications, etc. So this is what we said about authorship. We said that in mathematics and statistics, it's very common, but not universal to order authors alphabetically. And in fact, the same PhD supervisor, Charles Pearce, advised me when I first started publishing, always use alphabetical ordering of authors. And my name begins with a T, which means I'm pretty well always the last author. He said, if you do that, you can always avoid the question. And I think he was right. I'm happy that I did that. What I would say is I've done that pretty well universally when I publish with mathematical science colleagues, but if you're working in other areas, like with engineers or doctors or other people, then sometimes you do actually have to be cognizant of their own research culture. So you can look at my publication list and find papers that are not alphabetically ordered, but pretty well everyone that's been a collaboration between just mathematicians is alphabetically ordered. And of course, in a lot of disciplines, the last author's the senior one. You know, it's the lab head. So in some sense, being near the end has ended up as I get more senior in my career, it helps. Some people try to order authors by level of contribution, but then you've got to have a discussion about what the level of contribution is. And quite often I think maths papers, really it's a result of people bouncing off each other. And it isn't really so obvious how you can attribute contribution. And I've been on promotions committees where different co-authors have applied for promotion and they've each claimed a level of contribution, and when you add them up, it's more than 100%. And there was even a third author that wasn't part of the application. So that can happen. And I think it pretty well always happens. People think that, you know, they've contributed. So I try to get out of having to say how much of a percentage of a paper I've given. Now, possibly when I was younger, I could get away with it. I don't think anyone can get away with it now, and you're all going to be asked questions about what the contribution is. But if you've got alphabetical ordering, you can always say, well, that's the way we do it, and it's 30% each if it's a free author paper or whatever. One thing I would do say, it's virtually unknown for mathematicians or mathematical scientists to be listed as authors on papers where they've not made a substantial intellectual contribution. That is not the case in a lot of other disciplines. You can get your name in a paper because you got some data together, or you can get your name in a paper because you're the tech person in a lab. You can get your name in a paper because you were a person on the grant application that funded the research. We have much tougher rules, much tougher culture for people to be authors than most other disciplines have, which means that we don't actually publish as many papers as they do. We don't typically have as many authors on a paper as most scientific disciplines. But I think that's important to say that, because otherwise your promotions committee or your grant application panel will say, well, this person has not many papers. Well, the point is, if you've got your name in the paper, you've really deserved that. And to be blunt, in a lot of other disciplines, that's not true. So, any comments or thoughts? What I would say is, it's probably not a good idea to be all over the place with this. At least the advice Charles gave me a way to look at it when I started. And roughly speaking, I've been pretty consistent throughout my whole career. If you do alphabetical ordering sometime and you know, order of contribution other times or whatever, if you're a bit all over the place, then people don't know how to reach a publication list. So it's pretty good to at least have some idea how you're going to operate. Any questions or comments? Okay.
Sorry, Peter.
Yeah, Mehdi?
Sometimes also when you are in revision, I mean, for answering to the revision, maybe one guy put more contribution on the paper, something like this. I mean that the order of author is not something that's fixed, right? It can be changed until end of the paper if it's not alphabetically.
You mean, so you've submitted a paper?
Yes.
A referee's wanted a revision.
Yeah.
And then one of the authors has made a major contribution to the revision, which in some sense has changed the total contribution in a way that you might want to put. Look, most editors would, I guess, allow that. I must admit, I don't think I've experienced it. Have you, Andrew?
No.
Where authors have come and requested a change in the ordering. I don't think I've ever seen that. Let's say math science is pretty much universe. It's 60 or 70% alphabetical ordering. It's by far the most common.
That's what applied math.
Yeah.
Applied math.
I would say so too. In fact, I'll tell a story. There was an editor of the Australian Mathematical Society Bulletin who tried to enforce every group of authors to use alphabetical ordering. So he wouldn't even allow the authors to decide. He wanted to decide. We had to tell him to stop doing that because it really is the author's call. But he felt very strongly it should be alphabetical. So that was a very extreme one end of that. I wouldn't go that far. But I would recommend alphabetical. I've never seen the problem you're talking about. Nathan, you got any thoughts about ordering?
Just what you said, that alphabetical ordering is good because you can avoid all these issues.
Yeah. Okay. How do you choose a journal? Well, I just wanted to make one comment, and obviously it's a very famous comment of Groucho Marx, which I looked up to actually get the exact wording this morning. He apparently said, "I don't care to belong to any club that will have me as a member." One thing you don't want to do is submit to journals that solicit your contributions. Well, modulo a couple of things. There's a lot of journals, I probably get 10 or 12 dozen each week, journals asking me to submit things to them. And most of them are predatory journals. And if they're not very high ranking journals or very good places. If you might be lucky and get a top journal invite you to give a survey article or something. It's probably unlikely to happen to an early career researcher unless you could prove the result, which everyone wants to hear about. So mostly, if a journal's soliciting your contribution, you probably don't want to submit to that journal. So just be a bit wary of that. There's a lot around. There are predatory journals around, and you need to be aware of that.
It ramps up when you submit a PhD. As soon as you're in the database, they
There's predatory journals, yeah. And I get, these things like saying, "Oh, we read your article on Procrustery's metrics in assessing bushfire shapes," which I did actually write a paper with some co-authors. It's, right on the edge of what I've ever done. And they think I'm an expert in bushfires, and somehow they want me to submit to some journal, which is completely, it's completely obvious that they have no idea who they're talking to. So it happens a lot. So how do you choose a journal? Well, these are 3 comments that different people have made to me. I'm not saying particularly which ones I would support, or so a lot of maybe an old-fashioned view is you should submit your paper to the journal that's the most appropriate to its subject matter. I've heard people say you should submit your paper to the best journal that has got a chance of acceptance. And I've heard people say you should support your local journals. So, I think in the ideal world, we'd all agree that, if you've got a paper that's in a particular area and there's a journal that's specialised in that area, then that's probably the right place. The readers of that journal will typically be the people who will be interested in what you've written. But we are in a situation where people look at your publication list and judge you by it. That's unavoidable. If you're applying for a job, people maybe go and actually read your papers, but if that's not going to happen if they're looking at a grant application and you've got a publication list. They'll have a quick look at your publication list. They'll have some internal, even if they haven't got a real ranking of journals, they'll have some internal thoughts about which journals are good and which ones are not. And then they'll say, "Oh yeah, this person's got 3 papers and then applied probability, that's great." They do that. So if you've got a paper that's got a chance of getting accepted by the annals of applied probability, then it's probably a good idea to publish, to send it there. And in fact, my colleagues in economics, this is a very formal process. They really do know. They have almost a well ordering of all the journals, and they have, discipline-wide journals, and then they have top journals in each of the specialist areas. And so I found it quite interesting collaborating with economists, theoretical economists, because they really do have this. In other areas, it's the journal impact factor that matters, and I frankly hate all this quantitative stuff. And I think in the mathematical sciences, we can afford not to pay attention to journal impact factors. The local journals, well, we're all part of a community. I'm part of the Australian and New Zealand Applied Maths community, or the Applied Probability community, or the Australian Maths Society. I'm part of all those communities. And these communities have journals. But I guess my attitude is that those journals should survive by being good journals. They shouldn't survive just by local people, in a sense, giving them charity that they wouldn't otherwise have done. So they should try and be good journals, and I think they are, and that's great. So if there's something appropriate to submit to, say, the Australian Mathematical the Journal of the Australian Mathematical Society, then go ahead and do it. Or the NZM Journal, or the Australian New Zealand Journal of Statistics, fine. But I wouldn't do that. Don't submit a paper that you think you might get in the Annals of Applied Probability, or Annals of Statistics, to the Australian New Zealand Journal of Statistics. That would be a silly thing to do. Andrew, you have any comments?
There's also the question of whether these are commercial publishers or not.
Sure, and that's a good point. And I am going to come back a little bit at the end. As Andrew pointed out, quite a lot of journals are actually published by commercial publishers. Some are published by learned societies. A few are published, like the Journal of Applied Probability and Annals of Advances in Applied Probability, which I edit, are published by something called the Applied Probability Trust, which is, it's a not-for-profit that's meant to be trying to support publication in applied probability. The Institute of Mathematical Statistics publishes the Annals of Probability, the Annals of Applied Probability, Annals of Statistics, the Annals of Applied Statistics. They're all published by learned societies, and in some sense, they're our own journals. They're the journals of the community. There are other journals that are published by commercial publishers, and I think you have to work out what your attitude to this is. It's certainly true, I think, that the commercial publishers are gouging us all. They're using our labour and then charging us lots of money. On the other hand, I wouldn't advise people to cut off their nose to spite their face. If it really was the best journal to publish in, say, a Springer journal or an Elsevier journal, then I wouldn't tell people not to do it. I would ask them to think about it. Andrew, would you absolutely not do it, you think? Or?
I don't absolutely not.
Yeah.
Try and avoid.
Yeah. And there are sort of in-between things like Cambridge University Press or Oxford University Press that they are technically commercial publishers, but they are not quite in that for the for-profit like some of the others are. And in fact, Cambridge University Press published the Applied Probability journals and also the Australian Mathematical Society journals. Because really, what's happened these days is you cannot be a small publisher in academia anymore because libraries buy big bundles from big publishers. So the Applied Probability Trust is 2 journals. You get picked off by libraries if you've only got 2 journals. And the same thing with the Australian Maths Society. So what you have to do is get yourself allied with one of these big publishers. So yeah, that's something to be aware of. The whole area of academic publishing is in a bit of flux. I was going to say quite a lot about it, but I won't have time because I've got other things I want to say. But the general thing is just keep monitoring that because it is relevant to all of us. So what happens if you've now finally got your paper, you're happy with the way it looks, you've sorted out your authorship orders, and you're going to submit it? Well, most journals have some type of electronic editorial management system these days, and the ones I've interacted with are Scholar One, which we've just implemented in the Applied Probability journals. The previous journal I was editor of, Stochastic Models, also use Scholar One. There's a thing called Manuscript Central that some journals use. EDAS is quite common in engineering, and they use it for most of their conferences. So all of these systems are something where you go to a website, you usually have to log in and get yourself some sort of identity, and then you upload your paper in some way. And maybe you upload the LaTeX and it can compile it for you, or maybe you upload a PDF. I hope in math sciences we don't upload Word documents. Some journals will allow you to do that. What I would say about all these systems is they do paper tracking, article tracking well, but they all do communication really poorly. And that's because they're designed by people who are just thinking about the system, not by people who are thinking about the relationships of the people who are communicating. And one of the things that I always try to get people to think about, I've just realised I've got a typo there, is what's the relationship? Now, if you're an author and you're submitting to a journal, and let's assume it's a good journal and you want to get your paper accepted, and that journal requires you to jump through a hoop or two, well, you basically have to. I mean, unless you decide that's going to put me off the journal. So quite often they want you to put in some information about your own research interests or your keywords or something. And the reason they want you to do that is so they can put you on a database of possible referees for other papers. Now, that's a bit of a trade-off. You have to think about that. So if you're an author, the power relationship lies with the journal, and you pretty well have to do what they ask you to, unless you're really going to object and not submit there. On the other hand, if you're a referee, you're the one who's got the power. The journal's asking you to do a favour, to do them a favour. You don't have to referee a paper. No one has to referee a paper for a journal. So if I get this email message that says from some editor, some journal, which I may or may not have heard of, saying, I've just enrolled you in our referee database. And then I'll get a next message which says, oh, you've just been requested to referee this paper, accept or decline. And let's say you think, oh, well, maybe I'll do the job. And you go to it and have a look. First thing is, it's really rude if they don't send you the paper. If they don't send me the paper, I'll pretty well decline straight away. If they send me the paper and I think, well, maybe I can do the job. If I go to the journal website and it wants me to put in my keywords or stuff, well, I don't do it. Right? It's not reasonable for them to ask you to do that. But they try. So my advice there is, if you get asked to be a referee, don't let the journal push you around. You're doing them a favour. You can always say no. And if they make it too difficult, just say no. On the other hand, being a referee is really, really, really good experience, especially for young people. And I'm looking at Jason here. She's a PhD student, but she's done a refereeing job that I put onto her recently. And it's a good thing. It's good experience, because if you actually get to sit on the other side of the fence as a referee, it helps you as an author. It's a good thing to do. So I'm not saying you shouldn't referee. I think you should, but just don't let these electronic systems push you around. Anyone got any comments? Okay. So a lot of journals, I've actually listened to people say you must format your paper in the journal format. I could never understand why. Because all the journal needs is really a well set out, easy to read copy of the manuscript. It might get rejected. It might be out of scope. What's the point of formatting something in a journal's format if that's going to happen? I mean, if it gets accepted, okay, there's an issue then. You've got to be in the journal format. But that's a production issue. Once the paper's accepted, fine. Everything's got to be put in the right format. But for the point of view of refereeing, it doesn't need to be. It just needs to look good so that the referees can look at it. And as an editor, I've never worried about format. Now, having said that, some editors do. And the editor, as I pointed out, if you're an author, the editor's the one with the power, and you probably have to do what the editor asks you to do. But I know that if a journal tried to make me format something in a really complicated way, it wouldn't be a plus for that journal for me. Any thoughts or comments? So then what happens? Well, usually what happens is the paper goes to, in the journals I know about, the editor-in-chief, or maybe if it's a big journal and the editor-in-chief can't look at every paper, it goes to a senior area editor. And that person usually does one of three things. They reject it, which means they make a decision to reject it. And if they make a decision to reject it, they haven't read it. They haven't read the whole thing. They've probably read the introduction. They've decided that it's too boring, that it's badly written, that they'll have some reason, it's out of scope, whatever. Desk rejection happens. The rate of desk rejection in the sort of journals I know about is probably 25 to 30%. Now, you'd be surprised at how bad some papers are when they turn up at journals. I mean, they really are. So whether that's a reasonable statistic is open to debate. But a lot of papers don't even get anywhere near an editorial board member, never mind a referee. So the first person you've got to get past is the editor-in-chief. And this is where the abstract and introduction are important. Now, the editor-in-chief might think, oh, well, there is potential in this paper, but there's obvious flaws. Quite often it's about, you know, it could be actual production, it could be formatting, it might be the equations all look wrong, or, you know, the symbols are wrong, or something like that. I mean, that can happen. But if the paper gets through those two things, then what usually happens is that the editor-in-chief sends it to an editorial board member who's more expert in the actual topic of the paper. I'm going to call that editorial board member an editor from now on. This editor, who usually knows a bit more about the specifics in the editor-in-chief, might also desk reject it. They'll say, oh, yes, it's just a rehash of, you know, a paper on option pricing that got done back 12 years ago or something like that. They know more about the actual literature, and they might desk reject on those grounds. But if it gets through that, the editor will send out the paper to one or more referees for a detailed review. Now, the Journal of Applied Probability used to be notorious for only having one referee, which was good from a processing point of view, probably not great from a reliability point of view. It's moved to a situation that has usually more than one referee. But the fact is, in applied probability, there are only a small number of referees. So I would argue that applied probability is a discipline that actually operates on a small number of referees, and we expect them to do a good job type basis. I'll contrast this with, say, computer science, computer networking, or electrical engineering, which I sometimes publish in. Their way seems to be send it to a lot of referees and don't expect any of them to do a good job. And the highest number of referees reports I've ever had in a paper is 8. And they were numbered between 1 and 11. So there was a few numbers missed out in there. So it looked like they'd actually sent this paper to at least 11 referees. 8 of them had returned, and none of them said anything sensible because they all spent 10 minutes on it. So
probably they contradicted each other as well.
Yeah, that's right. How do you, well, in fact, I'm really proud of the fact that we actually got it through on the first revision with that many referees. Yeah. But so at least, and I'm not so sure about applied statistics and other things. This is something where culture does differ between even quite related disciplines. The sort of what's expected from referees is different. As I said, in applied probability, we expect best effort from the referees. I'm not going to hold a referee responsible if a paper gets published and there's a flaw in the proof. But I would hope that the referee is going to try and look at the proof and work out if they believe it. You know, and it's not like they might work through every single line, but you expect the referee to be expert enough to know what's going on. Whereas in other disciplines, I have heard this said by an editor in statistics, applied statistics, saying it's not the referee's job to check the maths, and I actually don't agree with that at all. So I think there are different ways of looking at this, but that's what happens. Any questions?
Sorry, Peter. Sometimes some journals, authors candidate some referees for, for the, editor-in-chief. You saw that type of journals.
Yeah, you're right. Sometimes they do. I find that a bit weird. Yeah, sometimes you'll be asked when you submit a paper to suggest some referees. Do your best if you try and think of something. I have had to do that, yeah.
Or maybe they specifically don't choose those people.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a question.
Yeah.
What do you do when you get a paper and you get the reviews back and it is obvious that the referees were completely inappropriate people to be reviewing the paper? I had a paper I submitted to JRSSA, and it was sent to a bunch of geographers to review, and they all wrote, I don't know anything about statistics or maths, but there aren't any maps in this paper.
Yeah.
It's pretty much summing up what they said.
I mean, I think you can have correspondence with an editor. I mean, there is content in an editor's job. An editor's job is not just to blindly follow what a referee says. And I would have thought in that case, you could say, look, all these reports have said they're geographers, not statisticians. It's a statistics paper. It obviously got sent to the wrong place, and would it be possible to have some statisticians look at it? Maybe you could even suggest a couple. Having said that, I will I'll move on to what happens when the referees' reports come in.
Yeah.
So once the referees' reports are in, the process goes in the opposite direction, of course. The referees recommend a course of action to the editor recommends a course of action to the editor-in-chief, and the editor-in-chief makes a decision. And usually it's the editor-in-chief that does the correspondence with the authors. So I guess in the situation you're describing, the referees all said, well, I'm not competent in this area. And it got to the editor. Now, you could argue a really good editor at that stage should possibly go and get some better referees before they even get back to the editor-in-chief. But I do want to say something else about this, which is this. A bad referee's report is not the referee's problem, it's your problem. Remember, the referee's doing the journal a favour. The referee's the best effort. It's you who wants your paper accepted. And if the referee's completely misunderstood it, or got it wrong, or made a mistake, that's all fine, but it's still your problem because it stopped the editor accepting your paper. And almost always, if you're honest, you get very angry when you get a negative report where the referees have got no idea. But then once you've left it in the drawer for 3 days and cooled down and had another look at it, and ask yourself the question, why did the referees misunderstand it? So the question, I mean, yours is obviously an extreme example. Why did they send it to geographers? You know, maybe there's a reason. So that's what I mean about this, is that the referees make mistakes. We all know that. We've all got angry about referees making mistakes. But if a referee has made a mistake, or if an editor has sent it to the wrong referee, ask yourself why that happened. The editors aren't doing this deliberately, and the referees, if they've misunderstood something, you know, let's assume they're not malicious. There are not very many malicious referees out there. So the referee's trying to do their best, but they've got it wrong. Ask yourself, how did they get misled? Did you write your introduction well enough? Did you introduce your notation well enough? You know, it gets back to, even if the referee's made a mistake, it's still your problem to fix it. If the paper's been rejected and you submit it to another journal, don't just submit the same paper, because for starters, in our small community, it might get to the same referee. That does happen. But even if it doesn't, you've actually not thought about the feedback you've got. And that's a silly thing to do. So, you know, it doesn't mean that the referee knows what they're doing, but if the referee's got it wrong, you ask yourself what the reason is. Now, a couple of other things. Let's assume that it's not completely terrible. The referees have come back with these reports. The editor said, yeah, we'll look at a revision. Now, usually when you get invited to submit a revision, it really is, unless you stuff things up from now on, a statement that the paper is probably eventually going to be accepted. That's a good thing. So what I would suggest, unless you really, really, really can't live with what the editors and referees want you to do, just do it. I mean, I've had the emotions. I've said, nah, they've misunderstood it. They want me to do this. I don't want to do this. And again, don't ever do this stuff in the heat of the moment. Wait a week or so and then think about it. And really ask yourself, can I live with that, right? Can I actually do what they want? And if you really can't and you send a polite letter to the editor explaining why, that's fine. But your first inclination should be do what they ask. And really, let's think about your objective here. I've explained the hierarchy, and I just noticed another typo there, that, you know, it goes from editor-in-chief to editor to referees. First papers always do that. Revisions don't always do that. Right? And what your goal should be with a revision is to get that paper desk accepted at the highest level you can. Now, it's pretty unlikely an editor-in-chief's going to desk accept it unless there's 3 minor points and we've dealt with them, and the editor-in-chief might say, fine. The editor-in-chief might flick it to the editor and say, seems to me they've done what we asked them to do. It looks okay. Can you just verify that it is? And the editor just checks it for half an hour and sends it straight back. That's the best thing. What you don't want to do is have an argument going on and the editor say, well, I don't know, let's send it back to the referees and see what they think. Because once it goes back to the referees, they start reading things in detail again and they might find other stuff that's a problem. And you see that, right? You see these papers go to the referees many times. And you think, well, if the authors had just quite backed off a bit, may not have got back to the referees. So quite often when things take a long time in review, it's because of that. So you should be thinking, what do I have to do to make it easy for the editor-in-chief and or the editor to just say, it's fine, before it even goes back to the referees. And one thing you should always do is write a commentary that explains how you address the various concerns. Most journals will ask you to do that now, but even if the journal doesn't, you should do it. You know, print out the referee's points. Put your comment in red, you know, say, oh, well, I've addressed this in paragraph 3 of page 4, you know. So that's, then the person reading it doesn't go back and read the whole paper. They just say, oh yeah, they've dealt with that one, and they've dealt with that one, and they've dealt with that one. So you're not in as much scrutiny the second time around. And as an author, that's what you want. Any thoughts from the experienced people? Okay, now just the final thing, and this gets back to a little bit Andrew mentioned before about commercial publishers. Many journals will ask for page charges. This is part of the whole open access movement. Point is, it costs money to run journals. Now it's quite clear that the commercial journals are gouging the market and they're charging a lot more than what it actually costs. But it does cost something. It costs the Applied Probability Trust maybe $400,000 a year to run its office and instead of to a management system, and that money's got to be made from somewhere. And most journals make it from subscriptions, from libraries, but there's a lot of people that say, well, that's not compatible with the fact that research should be available to everyone, publicly funded research, and there's this movement of open access. What I would say the open access movement hasn't sufficiently well addressed is who's going to pay for the inevitable costs of publishing. And the answer for them is the authors. So it's author pays, which I think seems pretty weird. You write the paper, you do all the research, you write the paper, you do all the work, and then you have to pay yourself to get it published. Some granting bodies will actually fund this to some extent. The ARC will fund it. They will allow page charges to be paid from ARC grants to a certain level. Just to show you, if you want gold open access, which means it's perfectly and freely available to anyone on the Springer website, you've got to pay $3,000 US per paper. That's not cheap. But the ARC actually requires, there's another typo, an access for the CCC. The ARC requires any ARC funded research actually to be open access, although I'm not sure in quite how this is enforced at the moment. But I copied this out of the ARC policy this morning. It actually says any research output arising must be openly accessible within a 12-month period from the publication date. What that actually is, that's called green open access. What it really means is the journal can have a monopoly on the publication for 12 months, but after that, it's got to be freely available. Yes,
and things like that. So you don't have to worry if you don't have to pay for it. You don't want to.
You could also put it on the archive.
Yeah.
Most probability journals, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the Applied Probability Trust has got no formal policy on this. I mean, we would never take I think no publisher will take on someone putting a paper on the archive because it would look really bad for them, even though Elsevier wouldn't do that. But it's probably technically a breach of copyright. So they're not going to fight it. Yeah.
After it's accepted, you put it on archive.
Yeah, so well, it depends on the journal, but most journals have a policy, and like most of the nice journals allow you to put it on the archive. Not the exact.
The immediate
version,
pre-publication issue is what they say. The one that doesn't have the right page number
exactly,
and the little logos.
Or
and
just a
stuff
previous
like
draft.
Yeah. They usually, I don't think anyone has ever complained about that, any publisher. But if you actually read the copyright release forms that they all make you sign, you probably are technically in breach of that. But I think it's one of these things that no journal, you're really got it. No journal's going to go after you for that. All right, so that's all I've got. We've gone a bit over time. Has anyone got any quick final questions or comments?
I've got one, Peter.
Yeah.
So you say that the AIC will pay for publication, is that right?
They allow us to use our grants to pay, yes. They won't pay extra.
So what's the ACEMS ruling on that? Because it comes up every time someone wants to publish something and then we have to scramble around trying to find money. And I think in the past we were told that we didn't use AIC money to pay for it.
Has to be in the budget, and I can't remember if it is.
Who's told you that?
We've discussed it. I think it even went to you guys, and then I was told that in the past you paid from your own funds, you personally, when you had an article published, so we weren't supposed to use ACEMS money for it.
I mean, I can't remember that question ever coming to me as director. I mean, it might have, but I can't recall it.
It has come to me. So
it has come to you.
And the solution is you don't have to pay for it. You can, and you can be supported from university contributions, but open access in regards to ARC policy means that it's on the university repository, and any paper that is published by a university employee has to go onto that repository, and that's open access. So you don't have to pay to have full public open access. They think that someone in a university system, that's enough.
Well, the question is, will they allow you to pay for that? I mean, if you want gold
It has to be in the budget.
I mean, I must admit, I've never, look, this is not true. Until about 2 years ago, I'd never paid page charges for anyone. And the first time I did it was one of the young lecturers in the OR group here, who actually got a paper accepted by what was a reasonable OR journal. And the journal tried to make him pay page charges. He said he didn't have any funds for it. And they said, well, we won't publish your paper. And so it really was, you pay the page charges or we don't publish. And it wasn't 3,000, it was something less than that, a few hundred, I think, is what I recall. And I did actually pay that out of my own consulting fund. The only other time I've done it was a paper that I wrote jointly with David Stanford and Ilse Ziedens. David's at the Western University in Canada. He wanted it to be gold open access. It was a Springer paper published in queuing systems. And he chose to pay the 3,000 US. I said it was against my principles to do it, but he wanted to, so we let him. But I think that you're not going to be able to get away with this. I mean, there is a big movement, and I forget the name. There's a Dutch guy in the European Union. A lot of the big funders, European funders like the Wellcome Trust and other things, the British Research Council, are requiring this type of very strong open access from the start, where they're actually arguing that the way it should be funded is not by university libraries paying subscriptions, but by universities paying page charges for their academic staff. I find that really weird. I don't want the bureaucrats in this university telling me what I can and can't publish. That I think is a really, really, really bad thing. But it's happening, and there's some very powerful people, particularly in Europe and the UK, that are pushing this. It doesn't quite seem to me to have much currency in the US, but it's, watch this space.
Can't pay for publications without ACEM funds, not ARC funds. That's not in their budget.
Well, the ARC has changed its rules.
Yeah,
It
but
might
it's
not
not
have
in
been.
our budget though, so we can apply for variation.
Yeah, well,
Don't
I'm pretty sure we
ask me to
could
do
if we
that.
really wanted to, but as I said, I certainly don't want to. But it is an issue, and some journals will try and get you to do it. You know, PLOS One, which was, well, here's a question, Kate. Because we trumpeted a paper that was published in PLOS One on the ACEMS banner heading of our website.
Which one?
The one about the female.
Oh, yes.
PLOS One's an open access journal that has page charges for every paper.
I think UNSW would have paid.
Well, whatever. Yeah. I mean, these things happen. You know, I actually don't know why PLOS One's such a prestigious journal. I actually don't think it should be, but there you go. That's just my opinion.
Well, I mean, again, there's a distinction between commercial and
Yeah.
private too. I mean, I try to pay page charges to the others because they're very cheap.
Yeah.
And worthwhile for a rich university, rich country to pay those.
Yeah, sure.
But they always say straight away, this has no influence at all.
Yeah.
You know, whether your paper is acceptable.
And prestigious principal journals will do that. But it's quite clear that there is a conflict of interest introduced in the editorial process by this. And you've only got to see all these predatory journals to know that.
The more you publish, the more money you get. I mean,
yeah. I actually don't understand why the debate's gone this way. I mean, there is a reaction against the commercial publishers gouging the system, and that clearly happens. But I'm not sure that the response has been very rational. Okay, we have got a long time. Any final comments? Okay, thanks everybody. I don't know when the next one of these sessions is, but we'll be sending out notifications from that. So thanks for your contributions.
Oh, sorry, there's a question from Matthias.
Okay, yeah.
Saying that unpublished work is work not done raises the question on how far one goes to get paper published. For example, suppose that one submits to an A+ journal and it gets rejected. One then submits to an A journal and then the same happens. Same for the B category, go to a C journal.
Well, I mean, journals aren't quite categorised so, you know, so obviously as that. But
if a paper
if a paper got
published in a C journal, is there anyone there to hear it fall or whatever? Is that the question?
I would have thought that if you submitted a paper thinking it's got a chance in an A+ journal, then there's a problem if it's not going to get accepted at a lesser journal. And you don't have to get as far down as C. So, you know, you should have some idea about the worth of your work. And if you think the work's worthwhile, and look, I've got a couple of papers right now that have got rejected. And in fact, they've been desk rejected. No, I'll tell you the story. First paper a few of us read on Bitcoin was the most downloaded paper from Performance and Evaluation, which is an engineering journal, for a year and a half. And we submitted another paper on Bitcoin and they just rejected it. So I don't quite get what was going on there in terms of, it was a change of editor. It didn't even get to the editor-in-chief, I'm pretty sure. But it was an area editor in that case. But, you know, so things can happen. So just because everyone gets papers rejected. We've all, so, you know.
So, I mean, in the process of submitting and getting rejected 4 times, hopefully you get some feedback at some point that would tell you how to improve the paper.
Yeah. And in that did happen. Well, the desk rejection doesn't give you feedback. We actually got it rejected a second time by another journal. We did get some feedback. So, yeah. The feedback was, we don't think this is interesting, which I thought was a bit weird. But, so, yeah, everyone's got stories. Okay, any others, Kate?
Hang on. I guess the real question then is to not publish or publish in a C journal.
Well, the journals are not categorized like that, right? It's not like, we shouldn't be thinking A plus A, B and C. We had that ranking. You know, if anyone wants to come down to Melbourne and sit in a pub with a beer, I can talk about that all night. But I think if you don't get your paper accepted in one journal and you think it's a worthwhile paper, you should resubmit it. Now, my recommendation would be, don't just resubmit it as is. Ask yourself what lessons you can learn. Ask yourself, did the referee misunderstand? And if so, why? You know, really don't just resubmit as is. That is a silly thing to do. But if you actually try and take on board whatever lessons are to be had and resubmit in a different place, and, you know, I have had that still fail, and yeah, it's not like you should give up. I don't think you should give up. I mean, maybe if it got rejected 4 times or something, then you start wondering, well, have I completely misassessed whether this is any good? But you have to have some of your own judgment about what you think about research is.
Can I ask a question? Because I'm obviously from a different discipline, but when we were always told, don't submit in those low-class journals, always go for the top ones, because it looks worse on your CV if you've got low-class journals. It's philosophy, it's not that different.
I mean, I would say that's certainly true that you don't want to be in a predatory journal.
Well,
for
not
sure.
predatory journals.
There are some that are pretty close. You know, there's some publishers that are not renowned as great publishers. One at Maths is in Darwin. Now, they do have one or two reasonable journals, but most of them aren't. So I think it can be that some journals don't look good on your CV, and you need to know how people are going to read your CV in your area. That's one of the things you need to sort of. It's one of the things that actually has been advised on when you put in a grant application these days. You should actually have a little paragraph that try and advises the assessors how to read your CV. You know, have I always used alphabetical ordering? You know, what are the good journals? You're actually specifically asked to do this now. So all of us should understand our own research context.
There's also a question of volume there. I mean, if all of your papers are in sort of these lower level journals, whatever, classify them, then that's not, doesn't look good, but it's just paper.
Everyone has a mixture of, you know, you hope there's some really top papers and there's probably some that are, you know, especially if you're supervising students or working with other people, not everything's going to be in complete top level. Okay. Thanks, everybody.